So this is more of an update video to the previous part rather than being a part 2 as such. In the previous video I got the costume into a pretty complete state, although there were a few elements I wanted to add to it, but it was more or less there. Now what you're seeing here is some footage from the Lincoln Steampunk Festival and the Asylum, and as you probably know, this is a festival I attend every year and build a new piece for every year. So I took the costume down there for the weekend and I wore it on the Saturday and on the Monday. I wore it for most of Saturday, so probably about 4 or 5 hours, then also for a few hours on the Sunday because there's a large parade that takes place through Lincoln. And it was pretty good, to be honest with you. It's one of these costumes that is fine to wear for 20 minutes in the front room, but once you've worn it for 4 or 5 hours it starts getting a little bit heavy. It wasn't too bad, but I was definitely feeling it after wearing it for an entire afternoon. But it's just one of those things, there's only so much you can strap to yourself before it starts becoming really, really uncomfortable, and that's just something you're sort of used to if you do attend the festival, because everybody's got lots and lots of stuff attached to them. It's just part of the game, unfortunately. So one element that the costume was lacking in the previous video was this, which is a servo skull, and as I mentioned in the previous video, this is something from the Warhammer 40,000 universe, and it's like a sort of a cybernetic skull which floats about the battlefield and conducts reconnaissance and various other bits. So it's quite a visual, iconic kind of item in the 40k universe, and it does sort of look a little bit steampunk. So I definitely wanted to include this because I thought this was a good opportunity to have quite a sort of a definitive steampunk element to the costume. So as you saw in the previous part of the video, I'd started adding some elements to the skull just by cutting out some gaps in the resin and adding in some various metal pieces. I've got like a light fitting and a sort of an eyepiece here as well. So I needed to do this pretty quickly. I had a few days before I had to leave for the festival, so I went down to the workshop and just started looking at what I had, what I could add to the skull. And as you can see here, I've got a shaped metal plate that I've added on here. Now this is something that I started doing a good few years ago when I was sort of first getting into steampunk. I wanted to try shaping some brass, so I bought myself these, which are doming bowls. And what you do is you get your metal, you put it over these shapes, and then you hammer it with a shaped hammer, and that will let you curve metal pieces out to various sizes. So I had a go at this just to see how easy it was, but I never really ended up using the technique for anything. However, I had some shaped pieces of metal that had been sitting about in a box for ages, and as it happens, one of them was more or less the perfect shape to fit onto the skull. So that was just a sort of a happy accident. So I just glued this on basically. I cut it to size a little bit, but I just glued that on and added some rivets just for some visual detail. So once I had that in place, I also wanted to start adding some additional detail, and I wanted to start adding in some airbrush hoses. So I've got some various adapters that I'm trying to fit into the front of this lighting piece here, and as luck would have it, it's got a screw thread in it of the exact size that I need for the airbrush hose. So I was able to attach this quite nicely, which was really, really useful. I did initially try this adapter, which would have worked well, but it was adapting to the wrong size, so in the end I went with some 10mm threaded tube there. Now I find cables quite useful actually, because obviously you want to have some cables in there to give some mechanical detailing, but what they're also useful for is hiding gaps and sort of rough edges. So if you've got a gap in your sculpture that you want to hide, or there's like a rough edge that you're not sure how to sort of terminate, what you can do is run a cable along it, and that just helps hide some of the problems with the piece. So I found that really useful here, so I'm just going to start gluing on some airbrush hoses to add some additional mechanical detailing. Right, so there we go, so that's not looking too bad. And as you can see, I've got some gas mask hose attached to the bottom. And what that's hiding is this piece of copper pipe. So that's quite useful because that can bend. So what that will allow me to do is to position the skull however I need it on the costume. The idea with the servo skulls is they're meant to sort of float about, so I think if I have a lot of trailing cables coming out the bottom, that might hopefully give some sort of impression that it's meant to be kind of doing its own thing. At least I'll get some sympathetic motion as I move around, because the cables will move back and forth. So now that I've got this into sort of a fairly decent position, what I now need to do is start painting it. I don't need to paint the brass shapes, of course, or the cabling, but what I do need to do is paint the skull. So what I'm doing is the same method that I've used for skulls previously, and I'm covering the whole thing in a layer of burnt umber oil paint, which is thinned down with white spirit. So this is really just a weathering pass. I'm going to wipe all this back off again with a cloth once I'm done, and that will just give me a nice weathered bone look. So now I've got that, I can now come in with an airbrush and just airbrush in some blacks to emphasise some of the more shadowed areas of the piece. So there we go, so that's not looking too bad. Now something else I want to do is to add a shoulder pad to the robot arm that I've made. That's all held on with like elastic and a rubber ball, so it's not particularly steampunk, so I want to kind of hide those details. And what I've got here is a piece, a cold cast piece that I made some time ago for my sort of Cthulhu summoning arm, which you may remember. This is just a test piece that I've had, and it's been sitting in the workshop for a couple of years now. Now as you can see, it's looking quite weathered, and actually a lot of that is natural weathering that just occurred from the piece sitting out in the workshop for so long. I've emphasised some of that with some oil paints, but the vast majority of that is just natural weathering, so I quite like the look of that. Now this piece didn't have any sort of finishing on it at all, so what I've done is to add some leather straps to the edges just to hide the rough edges of the fiberglass, and I think that looks pretty good. I mean, this was very quickly done, but I think that's been good enough to add to the costume. So what I'm going to do is just slide this along the arm. It's going to be attached with elastic so that it can move, and I'm just going to push this along the arm, and that should help me hide that detail that we don't really want to see. Okay, there we go, so it's not looking too bad, and as you can see, the arm can still move quite freely, so that's quite nice. I'm also going to use this shoulder pad, which I made for last year. You may recall this from the video from then, and that's a foam piece which is covered in leather and also some more cold cast details. So I'm just going to attach that to the side of the piece there as well, and that will go over my shoulder. Right, so there we go. So there's the costume pretty much finished. Now, I'm one of these who, the minute I sort of finish working on something, sort of immediately loses interest in it and starts seeing all the problems. So for a while I was like, it's not quite as good as I thought, and, having sort of worn it for the weekend and got a bit more used to it, I think I like it more than I did. I think a problem that I've had with a lot of my stuff recently is I'm sort of relying, I think, a bit too much on stuff I did previously. So to a lot of extent, this costume is made up of pieces that I've made for previous costumes, all the skull details, the shoulder pads, various other bits, the mask, are all things that I made for previous costumes, and I think maybe that's just making me a little bit lazy. So I've come back from the asylum quite enthused to do another costume, but this time I want to make sure that I make all of the pieces from scratch. I'm thinking I'm going to do another helmet, but try and improve on some of the problems I had with some of the previous helmets that I've made, and I want to completely avoid using anything that I made for a previous project. So I think that's going to do a few things. Firstly, sort of push me to do a bit more work, just stop being lazy. But I think the problem that I have with this one, and maybe some of the things that I've made recently, is that they're maybe a little bit piecemeal. Like in this one, some elements are leather, some elements are like plastic. I don't sort of see a design throughput through the whole thing, if you see what I mean. I think if you're going to use leather in a project and that's going to be sort of a design element, it should probably be more consistently used throughout the whole costume rather than just being one or two elements. So I want to try and do something like that, and I think use a lot more leather in the next thing. I think partially because if you make something out of genuine materials, then it just looks more genuine. I think I've sort of been using like foam and fiberglass and things like that here a fair bit, which I think is fine in certain circumstances. But I think things just genuinely tend to look better if you use genuine materials, like real materials, rather than trying to fake that look. So that's something I want to try for the next piece I make. And instead of waiting till sort of mid next year to start working on that for the festival, I want to start working on it this year, way ahead of time. So I think partly that will give me a lot more time to work on it, but also sort of break a sort of a cycle I've fallen into, where I sort of start a project in January, usually the original mecha contest, work on that for a few months, then abandon it, work on the asylum, and then end up in a situation I'm in now where I've come back from the asylum, I've finished my costume, that's all out of the way. I've now got to go back to the original mecha contest piece and try and finish that. And to be honest with you, much as I like what I've done so far, I'm not super enthused to start working on that again. And I think it can be a bit of a challenge to sort of regain interest in a project if you've left it for a while. So I want to try and sort of break that cycle a little bit for the next few pieces I make. Now, just before I head off, I just want to talk briefly about this, which is a Victorian tintype photo that I had taken at the event. A friend of mine, Greg, runs a company called Dark Box Images, and they use authentic Victorian photography techniques to produce these really, really cool images. I've had one done before, and you may have seen the video from a few years back, and Greg goes through the whole development process as you sort of wait for the photo to be developed, and it's really, really interesting to see it happening before your eyes. So I couldn't resist getting a photo done of this costume, and I think it really added a certain something to the creepiness of the costume. Also, I think the robe that I'm wearing is sort of dissolved slightly into the background of the image, so it really looks like the robotic arm is holding the staff, and you don't really tend to see my arm holding it as well, which I think is quite cool. So yeah, just a really, really nice image. I just wanted to quickly share this before I head off. But that's it for this one, so thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.